By 1930, Glenn Curtiss had already won the aviation wars. He'd beaten the Wright brothers at their own game, made the first official public flight in America, set speed records they couldn't match, won international competitions they refused to enter, and left them bitter enough to wage a patent lawsuit that would drag on for years. But here's the thing nobody talks about. After dominating the skies, Curtiss turned his restless genius to the road. And when he did, he built something so ahead of its time that today, fewer than a dozen survive from the nearly 300 he manufactured. This is the story of the 1938 Curtiss Aerocar, built specifically for a man named Augustus Post, a Broadway actor, fearless adventurer, virtuoso balloonist, and visionary aviator who made his living pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And what Curtiss built for him changed how America thought about travel. Let's start with Glenn Curtiss himself, because you can't understand this vehicle without understanding the man who designed it. In 1907, before he ever touched an airplane, Curtiss set a motorcycle land speed record of 136 miles per hour, not in a car, on a motorcycle he designed and built himself. In 1908, he piloted the June Bug, a plane he designed for Alexander Graham Bell's Aerial Experiment Association, winning the Scientific American Trophy by flying the first officially recognized, publicly observed flight in the United States. The Wright brothers had flown farther and longer back in 1903, but they did it privately, without official observers. Curtiss did it in front of crowds. On July 4, 1908, with over 1,000 people watching, he proved that powered flight wasn't some exclusive achievement locked behind closed laboratory doors. It was something the American public could witness, understand, and believe in. The Wrights weren't happy about that. They owned a patent on flight control, and when Curtiss refused to pay licensing fees to use aileron technology in his aircraft, they sued. The lawsuit wouldn't be resolved until 1914, and the bitterness it created lasted decades. But while lawyers argued, Curtiss kept winning. He won the Gordon Bennett Trophy in France in 1909, the Scientific American Trophy again in 1910, after flying from Albany to New York City. He set aviation records, designed seaplanes for the Navy, and created the JN-4 Jenny, the most widely used trainer aircraft in World War I. By the 1920s, Curtiss had already reshaped American aviation. But innovation, true innovation, wasn't about winning a single category. It was about seeing problems others couldn't see and solving them in ways nobody expected. That's why, after retirement from aircraft manufacturing, Curtiss turned to something that seemed completely unrelated: luxury motorhomes. Except it wasn't unrelated at all. Curtiss had always been obsessed with mobility. Speed, efficiency, weight savings, elegant design. He'd learned these principles building aircraft, and now he was going to apply them to a problem that had been nagging at wealthy travelers for years. How do you travel in comfort without sacrificing practicality? How do you make something both beautiful and functional? Lightweight yet substantial, luxurious yet economical? How do you design for a specific person, not a mass market? These were the questions that had driven him in aviation, and they drove him now in what he called the Aerocar. The Curtiss Aerocar wasn't invented in 1928. It was a refinement of an idea Curtiss had pursued since 1919, when he first developed what he called the motor bungalow. But 1928 was when he perfected it. The Aerocar used aircraft construction principles: lightweight aluminum frames, fabric-covered curved panels, tensioning cables borrowed directly from plane design. Every element was engineered to be strong without being heavy, beautiful without being decorative. The trailer featured a revolutionary fifth-wheel coupling system Curtiss had patented, giving stability and safety that earlier towing systems simply couldn't match. This wasn't a wooden box on wheels. This was a precision instrument dressed up as a home. The Aerocar Corporation, established in Opelika, Florida, in 1928, was backed by some of the era's most visionary entrepreneurs. Curtiss attracted investors like Alva Fisher, who'd made fortunes with Presto Light and developed connections with the automobile industry's biggest names. But here's what made the Aerocar different from every other luxury trailer. Almost none of them were identical. Each was custom built to order. The Aerocar was never meant for mass production. It was for people who already had money, discerning taste and specific needs, exactly the kind of person who might be an adventurer, a businessman, or in the case of our story, a man named Augustus Post, who happened to be all three. Augustus Post wasn't famous in the way celebrities are famous today. But in his time, among people who mattered, he was legendary. Think of him as a character designed by someone who'd read too many adventure novels. He was there at the birth of the American Automobile Association. He helped found it. He raced cars in the early days of motorsport. He flew airplanes, not as a casual hobby, but with skill and purpose. He piloted hot air balloons and broke altitude records doing it. He survived a ballooning accident in Berlin, where his balloon crashed through the roof of a house. He survived being caught in a Kansas City cyclone in a hot air balloon. He wrote books, he wrote poetry, he wrote the libretto for an opera. And on top of all that, he performed as an actor on Broadway, appearing in over 100 performances of a play called Omar the Tentmaker. How do you describe that to someone who's never heard of Augustus Post? You say he was the kind of man who refused to be limited by a single identity or skill set. Curtiss, having employed Post as one of his demonstration pilots back during his aviation days, understood that Post needed a vehicle that was as multifaceted as he was. He couldn't drive something ordinary. It had to be extraordinary. It had to be purpose-built, the way Curtiss built everything. The 1938 Aerocar built for Augustus Post was constructed on a custom Chevrolet chassis, powered by a 207 cubic inch overhead valve, inline six-cylinder engine. The towing vehicle itself reflected Curtiss's philosophy. It featured interior touches that mimicked aircraft design. The rear seats weren't just upholstered. They were aircraft-style reclining seats, the kind you'd find in a high-end airplane cabin, not a truck. Wood-trimmed windows, roll-up windows, a pull-down rear shade. Even the fifth-wheel coupling system mounted over the rear axle was based on aircraft tire and wheel technology, another Curtiss patent. This wasn't just transportation. This was a statement about what travel could be. The trailer itself was where the real innovation happened. It was built with internal partitions that allowed passengers to configure space as needed. A rarity in 1938, the sleeping quarters featured Pullman-style bunks, the kind you'd see on a luxury sleeper car from the golden age of American rail travel, but in a vehicle that could go anywhere. The most striking feature was the intercom system that connected the trailer to the driver's cabin. In 1938, think about that. This wasn't a home towed behind a truck. This was a mobile office and residence with its own communication infrastructure. The driver could speak with passengers in the trailer, send instructions, check on people, coordinate travel. It sounds like basic functionality now, but in 1938, it was futuristic. The attention to detail throughout the Aerocar was obsessive. Every fixture was selected for both function and elegance. The interior used natural wood finishes and upholstery that spoke to luxury without screaming about it. Storage was integrated throughout. Curtiss had learned about weight distribution and space efficiency in aircraft design, and he applied those lessons everywhere. What you got was a vehicle that could sleep multiple people, carry substantial supplies, and still maintain structural integrity across thousands of miles of American roads. The statistics are staggering when you consider the era. The Aerocar was approximately 30 feet in length. It weighed about 4,000 pounds empty, light by the standards of modern RVs, but engineered to be towed safely by the six-cylinder Chevrolet. The interior height gave comfortable headroom. The windows were positioned to give views, not just light. Even small things, like the windshield wipers on the front windows of the trailer itself, showed that Curtiss was thinking about practical problems. Weather management, visibility, safety. Not just luxury. Here's where the rarity becomes relevant. Between 1929 and 1940, the Aerocar Corporation and its licensed manufacturers built approximately 300 units. Some historians argue the number was smaller. Some say larger. But the consensus is around 300. Of those 300 vehicles, built in 2 countries across a decade, fewer than a dozen have survived to the present day. The Aerocar uses fabric-covered wood frame construction, materials that require maintenance and can deteriorate over decades of exposure. The interiors, filled with wicker furniture and period fabrics, were luxurious but fragile. Many Aerocars were used hard and eventually abandoned. Some were destroyed in accidents. Others simply rotted away under years of weather exposure. Augustus Post's Aerocar is one of the rare specimens that survived, and unlike some of the others, this one retained its custom specifications: the Pullman bunks, the intercom system, the aircraft-style details throughout. It became a piece of transportation history, a tangible artifact of a moment when American engineering, ambition, and craftsmanship were all at their peak, channeled not into weapons or industry, but into creating something beautiful that could move freely across the country. After Post's use, the trail gets a bit hazy. What we know is that the vehicle eventually came to the attention of collectors and historians who recognized its value. It represents more than just a luxury motorhome. It represents a specific philosophy about technology, design, and the relationship between the person using something and the thing itself. Glenn Curtiss didn't mass-produce his Aerocars because mass production would have betrayed the entire point. Each vehicle was supposed to be custom-built for a specific person with specific needs. Think about what that meant in 1938. Ford was making cars on assembly lines by the thousands. Everybody else in the industry was chasing volume. But Curtiss, the man who'd already revolutionized aviation, understood something that wouldn't become common wisdom in design until much later. The best products aren't made for everyone. They're made for someone. They're made for a person with a name, with needs, with dreams. Augustus Post dreamed of traveling across America in style and independence. Curtiss looked at that dream and built it. The Aerocar was marketed as the boathouse of the highway, a clever phrase that captured the idea. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a house. It was something in between, a space that moved with you, that adapted to your needs, that carried your life with you wherever you wanted to go. For a man like Augustus Post, who lived a life of constant motion and new experiences, new countries, new adventures, new stages to perform on the Aerocar wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. It was a necessity. What's remarkable is how many of Curtiss's innovations in the Aerocar became standard in recreational vehicles decades later. The fifth-wheel coupling system he pioneered is still used today. The idea of lightweight construction, informed by aircraft design principles, became the industry standard. The intercom system, the modular interior spaces, the integration of safety features into design rather than treating them as afterthoughts. All of these concepts were ahead of their time, but more than that, the Aerocar represented an approach to engineering that asked, who is this for and what do they actually need, rather than how do we make this as cheaply and quickly as possible. That philosophical difference matters. Augustus Post's 1938 Aerocar was built in an era when you could still commission something custom-made, still get a craftsman to think about your specific life and build something around it. Today, we've lost a lot of that. We buy what's available, configure within preset options. The Aerocar represented a different idea entirely, the engineer and the customer in conversation about what a life on the road could be. If you consider yourself someone who values craftsmanship, who appreciates engineering that reveals its thinking, who loves the history of how things were made before everything became about algorithms and Optimization. The Aerocar is worth studying. It's a lesson in what happens when brilliant people turn their attention to problems that matter to them personally. Glenn Curtiss beat the Wright brothers at aviation because he cared more about practical flight than patent battles. He built Aerocars, and specifically, he built one for Augustus Post, because he understood that the same principles that made a great airplane could make a great traveling home. The 1938 Curtiss Aerocar, built for Augustus Post, survives as a reminder of that moment when engineering was personal, when excellence wasn't about scale but about intention. Fewer than a dozen of these vehicles remain. When you see one, you're looking at a moving laboratory of 1930s design thinking, a custom-built response to a specific dreamer's needs, a conversation between a man who refused to be ordinary and an engineer who understood exactly how to build something extraordinary. That's the Aerocar. That's Glenn Curtiss's last gift to American travelers. And that's the story of why a Broadway actor and daredevil balloonist needed something built just for him. Because some people don't travel to go places. They travel to become who they already are. The Aerocar made that possible. Drop a comment below if you knew about Augustus Post before watching this, or if Glenn Curtiss' story of beating the Wright brothers surprised you. These are stories that don't get told often enough, and I'm curious what draws you to them. For more about Post's incredible life and the early history of the AAA, there's a fascinating documentary called The Unforgettable Augustus Post that's worth seeking out. Link in the description if you want to dive deeper. If this kind of design history and transportation innovation interests you, stick around. There's plenty more where this came from.